Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the special pastor chat with our special guest, Dr. Joel Lundberg, as we tackle some questions and highlight some concerns that folks have had about the current COVID epidemic, as well as concerns over the vaccine. Before we get into our discussion this evening, I am going to tell you that in case we experience any technical difficulties on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook channel, be sure to log on to our gracechurchfdl.org site. That's gracechurchfdl.org. You should see the website there on the screen. And so if we run into technical difficulties on either our Facebook or YouTube, be sure to click over onto our gracechurchfdl.org site. And so without further ado, Dr. Joel, thank you so much for joining me this evening and for sharing your time with us. I know this is definitely an area that's been of a lot of concern to a lot of folks, and it has raised much controversy within and without the church for a number of months now, and especially pertaining to the vaccine and COVID in general. I've got a few questions I've got prepared here, and I know that you have some areas that you're going to be sharing with us. But first thing is, a question I have for tonight is, can you, first of all, give us a little intro, tell us about some of your expertise as you obviously have to deal with patients who have immune issues or cells that are out of order. And tell us a little bit about your background and some of the info that you'll be sharing with us tonight.
Thank you, Grant. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and look forward to our time together. So I practice hematology and oncology in Fond du Lac and Waupun, and been in the community for about 30 years now. And it was just a year ago this week, in fact, that the COVID-19 pandemic hit in the United States. And if you recall, Fond du Lac actually had some of the first cases in the country. The first identified cases were actually in Washington State, but we were close behind. We had a couple of patients admitted to the hospital, one of whom had recently come off an Egyptian river cruise, and another individual who was at the hospital and clinics helping us to convert to a new electronic medical record, a husband and wife team who were from Maryland, and they were some of the first to contract the coronavirus, and that brought the Centers for Disease Control to town to investigate our outbreak and to give some recommendations on containment and tracing the cases backwards. And unfortunately, those two individuals, a 55-year-old man and a 45 or 49-year-old gentleman, both died from the disease, and within about 2 or 3 weeks of their hospitalization. So it's affected our community greatly. We at the Cancer Center have had to make adjustments very quickly, and of course last spring when we had the 2-month shutdown, we had to make decisions about whether we could continue treating our patients, many of whom could not afford to have a pause in their treatment, and others needed to get started. So for the most part, we continued our treatment of our cancer patients with radiotherapy, chemotherapy, immunologic treatments, and the like, although a lot of our colleagues in other areas in medicine had to stop or slow down tremendously, including elective surgeries. So we've been perhaps not on the front line at the Cancer Center, but we've had several of our patients contract the virus, and unfortunately I've had 3 die from the infection, the most recent just this past Saturday. And we've had a number of our staff become ill, thankfully, no one very, very sick, but we've had to put our staff on quarantine and move things around a bit to accommodate lesser staffing, and it was a difficult time. But primarily for those working the emergency department and the intensive care unit, and our hospitalist staff at times were overwhelmed, and particularly this last November was a very, very bad month for peaks in hospitalization and deaths. But much better now. We've seen in the last 6 weeks like a 77% decline in cases and hospitalizations in the area, and that's been reflected nationally as well.
Well, that's excellent. That's all good news then, as we feel like we're rounding the corner on this. And now I know that we're going to spend some time, kind of the bulk of our evening, to talking about vaccines. I know that as I've done some digging and having chatted with you earlier, the predominance of vaccines hasn't really taken off here in the U.S. or worldwide since the early 1900s. There was some evidence possibly of a vaccine back in China, roughly 1000 AD, but we've seen mankind survive without vaccines. So how did we, as people, how do we develop immunities naturally? What is programmed into us by the Lord that allows us to encounter an infection and overcome that? Obviously, we've survived a few thousand years without vaccines. So how does that usually work, and why do we then need to have vaccines as we see them now being pretty prolific in our society?
So, yeah, you're right. As the Psalms say, we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and God created us with inherent protections, an immune system to fight off unwanted invaders, so to speak, whether it's bacteria or viruses or fungi or strange opportunistic infections. So within our DNA, within our genes, we have the program for an immune system that has several different arms, things called B cells and T cells and macrophages and other things, even the basic white blood cells that fight the basics of infection. So all of these things can create antibodies and even things called killer T cells that can attack various microorganisms to keep us from getting serious and life-threatening infections.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, I remember watching a documentary a couple of years back, and it talked about DNA, and we're gonna unpack a little bit more about DNA in just a bit. But I know that when we come in contact with a sickness, a virus, that our DNA does remember that and learns to build antibodies. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, that's right. I mean, once we've been exposed to a certain infection, our immune system recognizes that and then develops antibodies against it, but it also remembers. So there's what's called an amnestic response or a memory that allows your body, if it's re-challenged again with the same type of bacteria or virus in the future, you can mount an immune response, assuming you have a normal immunity. Yes.
All right. Well, again, as you stated from Psalm 139, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I like that passage because I imagine David looking in the mirror going, I know it full well. So without being conceited, I have to be truthful, folks. So what can I tell you? But let's take a moment now. We have a video compliments of yourgenome.org, and it kind of unpacks a little bit about the DNA and what happens within our cell. And we've got to remember that we have about 70 trillion cells in our body. So we, again, are fearfully and wonderfully made. And DNA is unpacked, and our bodies within the cells are creating proteins trillions of times a minute. I mean, this stuff is happening at such a fast pace, and it truly is a wonder to behold. And so this little video, it's about 3 minutes, is going to show you how something called messenger RNA works with our DNA in order to create the proteins that will build our bodies. And Dr. Joel will tell us a little bit more about how that all works together to bring healing and immunity and help us. So let's take a few moments now to watch this video.
Here is a cell, the basic unit of all living tissue. In most human cells, there is a structure called the nucleus. The nucleus contains the genome. In humans, the genome is split between 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each chromosome contains a long strand of DNA, tightly packaged around proteins called histones. Within the DNA are sections called genes. These genes contain the instructions for making proteins. When a gene is switched on, an enzyme called RNA polymerase attaches to the start of the gene. It moves along the DNA, making a strand of messenger RNA out of free bases in the nucleus. The DNA code determines the order in which the free bases are added to the messenger RNA. This process is called transcription. Before the messenger RNA can be used as a template for the production of proteins, it needs to be processed. This involves removing and adding sections of RNA. The messenger RNA then moves out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. Protein factories in the cytoplasm, called ribosomes, bind to the messenger RNA. The ribosome reads the code in the messenger RNA to produce a chain made up of amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acid. Transfer RNA molecules carry the amino acids to the ribosome. The messenger RNA is read 3 bases at a time. As each triplet is read, a transfer RNA delivers the corresponding amino acid. This is added to a growing chain of amino acids. Once the last amino acid has been added, the chain folds into a complex 3D shape to form the protein.
Okay, so messenger RNA then, from what we saw in that video, is the key to piece of information to making sure that the correct antibodies are developed, as best I understand it from that video and from what I've seen so far. Is that kind of accurate?
Yes, the messenger RNA is the template for protein production, and that's correct. It's a complex process, but that little film did a very nice job of showing you the basics. And the messenger RNA is the platform for a couple of the currently approved COVID-19 vaccines.
Okay, so I know some of the typically vaccines take years, if not decades, to develop and to be tested and to go through. Is it clinical trials? Is that the correct? So yes. They go through all these clinical trials, and obviously, as you pointed out, we got the first cases of COVID here in Fond du Lac and in the U.S. about this time last year. So this seems to be a very quick development. How has the development of the vaccines, how has this been different? Because it seems to have broken through quite a few of the normative protocols for vaccine development.
Right. So the modern vaccine era is really less than 100 years old and really maybe only about 75 years old. Some of us can remember when we were children getting smallpox vaccinations. You get a little scarification on your arm, and you were inoculated with some basically dead smallpox virus, and then shortly thereafter we had the polio vaccines, and then measles, mumps, rubella, and it would take years to develop effective vaccines. The rush to get the polio vaccine in the late 1940s and 50s took essentially almost a decade until we had the Salk and Sabin vaccines. Typically vaccines were developed in culture, in egg culture, and you'd have to grow out the viruses, and that was one of the reasons where if you were allergic to eggs, you couldn't take a vaccine. But things have changed a lot in the era of molecular genetics and molecular research, and we've been able to move things ahead very quickly. And the new generation vaccines have been actually, in some sense, in development for a few years because the technology has been developed, and they've been working on this for quite some time. So in an urgent need like we've had in this last year, things were ready to be put into motion for a new generation of vaccines that are in large part based on messenger RNA, at least 2 of the currently 3 approved vaccines.
Okay. Now, I just want to follow up on the approval, because some of what I've read has said that the current vaccines are only approved for emergency use, or EUA, emergency use authorization. Is that an accurate statement? Is it only intended for emergency use at this point?
That's correct. There are different levels of approval, and this was an emergency use authorization by the FDA for these vaccines, and the approval was based on efficacy and safety demonstrated in clinical trials that were ramped up very quickly, less than a year ago by the major vaccine makers, and now we've seen 3 vaccines receive emergency authorization. And so this is a very unique, and to use an overused word, unprecedented, but it was necessary and important.
Yes. And we have seen an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented.
Yes, that's right.
And then now, as a physician, when you have a particular a patient or a case that you're dealing with, what are the parameters under which you can use something that might be deemed dangerous or experimental? Is it purely as a last measure to preserve their life? Do you have set parameters, or is it on an individual basis?
Yeah, so in oncology and hematology, we have approved treatments that have been vetted and tested in clinical trials and approved by the FDA through vigorous testing and review process. As you already mentioned, there are clinical trials, different phases, phase 1, 2, and 3 of clinical trials. Many of these drugs have undergone in laboratory testing, animal testing first before getting to humans. But if we get into a problem with a patient when they've exhausted all their standard therapies, but there's a promising medication out there that we have read about in clinical trials, we can seek emergency, what we call compassionate use authorization from the FDA. We can approach the pharmaceutical company and ask if we can have access to that drug, and we've actually had to do that just in the past week for one of our lung cancer patients, not yet approved oral targeted therapy for a patient who has very rapidly progressing lung cancer. So, generally these would not be considered dangerous treatments because they're already been through most of the clinical trials process, but they're not approved, and there are risks with any new treatment, of course.
Of course. Now, I know that some have expressed concern about the development of the current the current generation of the vaccines. Some are believed or have in the research have used fetal cell lines, and others, as we talked about earlier, use the messenger RNA. Can you tell us a little bit what's the difference between? I mean, I don't know much about DNA except that it's buzzing around my body. But other than that, what is the difference that then between the use of messenger RNA and the use of these fetal cell lines?
Okay, so I guess we can talk about the messenger RNA vaccines first, because they were the first to be tested in large-scale clinical trials. They were the first that the FDA authorized. Pfizer's vaccine, given 2 doses every 3 weeks, was the first, and then more recently Moderna, 2 doses 4 weeks apart. These are messenger RNA viruses. Basically, it's kind of like a Trojan horse. The messenger RNA for the spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus is encapsulated in kind of like a mini fat molecule. It has a lipid bilayer, and then it has some other things on the surface called PEG, polyethylene glycol, and basically that's what you're getting in the vaccine when you get your shot in the arm. And this little Trojan horse with the messenger RNA gets taken up by your cells, your immune system. The messenger RNA gets released, goes to the ribosome. The protein is made, and that is the viral spike protein. And then that gets out of the cell, and then the immune system recognizes it as foreign, and then all of a sudden you start getting an antibody response, you get a T-cell response. That's how that vaccine is basically works. Now, in the manufacturing process, there are no cultures involved. There are no eggs. There are no fetal cell lines. This is, free of those fetal cell lines, with one exception. The fetal cell lines were used briefly in the testing phase of the vaccine, but not in the manufacturing phase. And we probably should talk a minute about what are fetal cell lines. So fetal cell lines are immortalized cells, and there are 2 of them that were taken from aborted fetuses. One back in 1972 in the Netherlands. This was presumably an elective abortion that a woman chose to have done, and they basically took the kidney from that baby and developed a cell line that they could pass and continually keep going year after year, and they've been using that cell line for medical research purposes. There's one other cell line called the PRC6 cell line. That came from an aborted fetus in 1985, and that was from the retina. So these are 2 immortalized cell lines that started with babies, and that have been continually maintained over the years in the laboratory and have been used for research, including vaccine production. And we have other immortalized cell lines called the HeLa cell line. You may have heard about that. Helen Lane was a black woman back in the 1950s, early 60s, who died of cervical cancer, and her cervical cancer cell lines were taken and immortalized and continue to be used for research purposes, and there are others. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are messenger RNA vaccines that do not use the fetal cell lines in their manufacture production. Yes, very briefly during the testing phase. However, the more recently approved Johnson & Johnson Janssen product does use the HEC 293 cell line. That was the one from the Netherlands. That's the oldest in the production of the vaccine. So in the production phase, in the culture, the fetal cell lines are there producing the vaccine, and in the final process, the fetal cells are washed off the final product such that the vaccine that's available to individuals now does not contain any fetal cells. It just has the protein, and they use another process called an adenovirus vector. That's what these vaccines use as well, and it gets complicated, but none of these vaccines involve more abortions. These came from 2 babies many years ago, so people don't need to worry about, that the abortion industry is supplying fetal tissue for the production of these vaccines. That is not the case. Do you want me to comment about the ethical issues regarding these now, or?
If you certainly can. I'm I've heard the information, and it's just trying to process, the gravity of number one, of the medical situation that we find ourselves, but also just the tragedy that brought us even to experimenting with the tissue. It's an ongoing process for me, and it's still a grievous one. Still trying to process that. Sorry, that's just the reality. So, but yes, if you could touch on the that aspect from the ethical aspect for yourself.
So I would just preface my remarks in saying about this. There has been a great deal of concern that the vaccines have been rushed, that the process has occurred too quickly, that due diligence hasn't been performed. But I would reassure people that that's not the case. Yes, this has been a very rapid production of these vaccines, but it's been done properly and appropriately, and it is a testimony to God's providence that we do have effective vaccines, and this has happened so quickly in under a year. But the origin of these vaccines and the concern that some of them are produced using the fetal cell lines has obviously engendered a lot of discussion and controversy, and a number of national organizations have weighed in on this even before the emergency authorization of these vaccines. And some of the organizations include the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is a Right for Life organization, of course the Catholic Church, and the Southern Baptist Convention Ethics and Religion Commission. And I'll just make a couple of comments regarding the currently available vaccines. The Charlotte Lozier Institute considers that both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are the RNA-based vaccines that don't use fetal cells in their production, are, to quote them, both ethically uncontroversial. They are both ethically uncontroversial, so acceptable for Christians to receive. The National Catholic Bioethics Center has essentially stated that all of the vaccines are acceptable for practicing Catholics to receive. However, just in the last couple of days, some of the archdioceses around the country, one of which is in New Orleans, the Archdiocese of Louisiana, has considered that the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine, because it uses fetal cell lines in its production, is morally compromised, and that's a quote. So they are directing their parishioners to receive either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines.
If I may follow up just a second there, when somebody is going to see their physician or the clinic, is there a way possible for them? Because it's obviously there's a scheduling process. Is there a way that somebody can inquire as to which of the vaccines they are about to receive? Is that disclosed? Again, I have not gone through that process. Typically, people see, oh, this is the vaccine, and off they go. But is that disclosed as to which of these that they are receiving?
Yeah, it absolutely is. You will be told which vaccine you're receiving, and up until just the last couple of days, you could only receive the RNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna. But now the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is coming on board. So you can inquire, and I think you can probably inquire even ahead of time at your vaccination site what vaccine is available. And at least up until this point, all of our staff and all of our patients have received one of the RNA vaccines. But yes, this is part of informed consent. Yes, you can say, I want this vaccine, but I don't want that one, but that might, push you back further in line in the queue. But you can certainly choose to receive one over the other.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Just a question now with messenger RNA. I don't know much about messenger RNA, but I do work a little bit with computers. And I know that sometimes you can get the programming wrong and it doesn't do what you want it to do. Do we run the risk of somehow the messenger RNA that is being placed into our cells, into our DNA, could it reprogram something so that we have a system crash? Is that a realistic concern, or have I been reading too much sci-fi?
The messenger RNA is not incorporated into your genome. It's not incorporated into your DNA. We're not producing genetic engineering here. So it is safe in that regard, and so there really are no concerns about long-term genetic mutations causing problems for us in the future. And that maybe is a segue to talk about the safety of the vaccines.
Well, why don't you do that then and follow right up with that?
Okay, so again, one of the great concerns is that the research was too fast, that these vaccines were rushed, but they went through the usual process of phase 3 randomized clinical trials in which several thousand patients got the vaccine and several other thousand did not. And that's where we got these figures of 94% efficacy for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is stated to be 72% effective in preventing cases, but 100% effective in preventing serious cases that would require hospitalization or death, potentially. So what has been the experience so far? This was just recently reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, February 18th, so just about 3 weeks ago, not even. The initial experience with the Pfizer vaccine, and many of you may have heard this on the news, there were 2 episodes of anaphylaxis, which is, the very serious allergic reaction that you can get if you have a peanut allergy or seafood allergy or an allergy to a vaccine that you shouldn't be getting. And the first 2 episodes of this were in the United Kingdom because they rolled out the Pfizer vaccine first. And these were in 40 and 49-year-old women who were healthcare workers. They both had known food and drug allergies, and they had EpiPens on them. So when they got the anaphylactic reaction, they were able to get themselves an injection with the EpiPen and reverse that. The first anaphylactic reaction in the United States occurred in Alaska in a 32-year-old with no history of allergies, and that created a lot of concern and consternation. And there have been others since that. As far as we know, there are no fatalities related to anaphylaxis. There have been occasional reports of a couple of people dying a day or two after they got the vaccine, but that is not clear what happened there. There was no obvious allergic reaction. So the basic expectation in vaccines is that you will have an allergic reaction in 1 in a million vaccine administrations. And the estimation of the frequency of anaphylaxis in the Pfizer vaccine initially, based on these reports, was about 1 in 100,000. But it's probably going to be much less than that now as more and more people get vaccinated. The Moderna vaccine came out later, a little bit later, and there was one initial anaphylactic reaction in the United States in December, somebody who had a previous shellfish allergy, and that person had an EpiPen, epinephrine, and was able to reverse the reaction. And it's interesting that we think that these allergic reactions might be due to the fatty microvesicle that we put the messenger RNA in. There are these little protrusions on the surface that are made of polyethylene glycol. Right. And it's interesting that we use this compartmentalization, these nanoparticles in some of our chemotherapy drugs, and even in bowel preps for your colonoscopy. Oh. And there have been anaphylactic reactions in both of those settings, giving chemotherapy with these envelope nanolipids and in other settings. So the thinking right now is that that may be the trigger in some of these anaphylactic reactions. But generally, these vaccines have been very safe. A lot of people have sore arms. There was just a report out today that there are some delayed reactions of swelling and redness in arms that can look pretty significant. I saw one today in clinic in Waupun, but they all subside without sequelae.
All right. Part of the, I think part of what the concern as well with just related to the vaccine as well in general is, I think the idea is that, this is a 99% survivable virus. Is there truly a need for the vaccines? I mean, I remember growing up seeing the effects of polio and seeing middle-aged folks walking around with the metal things on their legs and stuff like that, and obviously you can see, okay, well, we don't see that now because of the efficacy of those vaccines. If we're seeing something that it does have this a 99% survivability, is it necessary that we are even talking about the vaccination, never mind actually trying to get everybody vaccinated?
So I think that the answer to that is a resounding yes. The mortality in the United States in the past year, we've lost 510,000 people to the pandemic. That still pales in comparison to how many we lost in 1918 with the influenza pandemic. But nonetheless, 500,000 patients have died, and it has affected mostly the elderly. Most of the deaths have been in 70 and 80-year-olds, but also, unfortunately, a number of younger patients, predominantly in underprivileged socioeconomic groups, blacks, Hispanics, city dwellers, where they can't socially distance, they don't have, they have to go to work, and they can't take the precautions of working remotely at home, and whether they were bus drivers or grocery store workers. There have been also a lot of healthcare workers who have died from the virus, nurses and doctors. And so, yes, the case fatality rate is relatively low. It's 1% or less. But this is such a widespread infection, international pandemic. And I think all you have to do is look at the example of Sweden, who chose not to do lockdowns, not to do masking and social distancing, compared to their Nordic neighbors, and they've had a 8 to 10-fold higher mortality rate in their population than Norway, Denmark, and Finland.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize there was that high over there. The current vaccines require 2 shots within 3 weeks of each other, and appear to be effective for 9 to 12 months. And so, are you seeing a potential for future vaccinations as we look into 2022 and beyond?
Well, the honest answer to that is we don't know right now. We're hoping that the vaccine will confer a lasting immunity, or at least a year, but it's very possible that we may need to have boosters periodically. Pfizer is already looking at their cohort of patients and starting to do studies of a third vaccination, a booster vaccination, to see if we can enhance long-term immunity with that. So, that is still an unknown and a subject of clinical research.
Okay, excellent. And then just related to, longevity, I've heard the term herd immunity. What is that in reference to? What is the benchmark for herd immunity? How do we get there? And do we have a kind of a timeline of when that might be achieved?
So the term herd immunity comes from the veterinary world and veterinary medicine. And basically it refers to having enough people or enough animals in the community become immune to an infection, that the infection doesn't have enough hosts to infect any longer, and it can't move through a population as readily. And so the thinking is, and you've all heard that figure 70 to 75%, that we need to have that level of immunity established in the population to get the virus infectivity to die out or subside to a very low level. And as Dr. Fauci from the NIH said some weeks ago now, that has never been achieved through natural infectivity. It's only been achieved through vaccination in history. Vaccination for the polio virus, vaccination for smallpox, vaccination for meningitis, and other such things. And Sweden was trying to achieve that through natural infectivity of the population, and they chose not to, lock down. They chose not to do the social distancing or mask wearing, hoping that they could achieve enough infections in the population that herd immunity would be achieved, but it's failed. And I think that the lesson to be learned there is, as Dr. Fauci observed, is that that's never been achieved other than through mass vaccination.
Wow. Okay. Well, again, certainly a lot of info for us to digest tonight. And so, again, thanks, Dr. Joel, for sharing your time and your expertise and your insights with us. I know you had a quote that you wanted to read, just kind of bringing thoughts together about the time in which we live, in which we can kind of lean on the sciences as it relates to what our next steps are. If you'd like to share that.
Sure, thank you. So Christianity Today, which, interesting, was a magazine founded by Billy Graham several decades ago, is something that my wife and I subscribe to, and they have written a lot about the pandemic over the last year, and there was a short article in this last issue that came out just a week or so ago, and this was an essay from an Anglican minister, and I won't read the whole thing, but just a couple of paragraphs. And it says, "The first thing to say about our battle against COVID-19 is that it represents a feat of human genius and diligence. Our dash from discovering a deadly virus to administering the first batch of vaccines in less than a year is a testament to a lot of people doing a lot of hard work. Medical researchers, public health officials, doctors, nurses, and first responders have labored heroically day in and day out. The second thing to say about our battle against COVID-19 is that it represents an act of God. Vaccines, ventilators, hand washing, face masks, and healing are astounding gifts of grace amid suffering and illness. There is no contradiction between these two ideas. Our work and God's work are blessedly and inseparably entwined."
All right. Well, again, thanks, Dr. Joel. I appreciate, again, your time as always. And before we head out, any things that we can be praying for you, for your family, for your practice right now as we look to the near future?
Well, our family's going to be making a transition later this summer, and I'm going to be stepping back from my practice in town. I've been here 30 years, and Wendy and I are hoping to move to closer to a family in the Milwaukee area, and I plan to not be doing private practice anymore full time, but transitioning to part-time work and locum tenens. We also hope to get back to West Africa and do some mission work there in the Cameroon, and we've both been able to work there, she in education and me in medicine. So if things open up so that missions travel is possible again, we hope to do that even yet this calendar year. So ask you for prayer, and we still need to sell our house.
All right, so if you are in need of a home that overlooks a lake, speak to Dr. Joel. He's got one just that's right up your alley. Actually, it's not even an alley. It's more of a nice forested area with a beautiful view. I've been there. It is luxurious. So be sure to check out the website that has that listing. Let's pray together right now. Father, we thank you that you are the God who has loved us with an everlasting love. And Lord, even today as I was reading and spending time in Deuteronomy and hearing Moses' words to the people of Israel, of the warnings of staying close to your heart and pursuing what your mandates are in Scripture, one of those promises was that you would keep the same pestilence that you brought upon the Egyptians off of them, and you would protect them. And so, Lord, I just ask that you, by your Spirit, would guard our hearts, guard our thoughts, and guard our homes and our well-being from these pestilences that continue to sweep through the earth. And that, Lord, together, even as your people, we might live in health and wholeness and experience the wonder of your healing. And so, Father, if you, as we pursue you, that if you would do that, that we, as your people, might be a testimony to this world that our God is great, our God is good, and our God is a healer. Father, we thank you again so much for those that you have raised up, like Dr. Joel and the physicians that you have brought into our lives to bring hope and healing and restoration to broken bodies. And I just pray for him. And Lord, even as he and the family continue to search for ways in which they can be involved within this community, to be involved within the greater missional community, I just ask your blessing upon him, and that, Lord, even that the right buyer, even now, would contact them so that they can, again, sell their home to be a blessing to another family. Father, we thank you again that you have loved us with an everlasting love. May your Spirit be at work in us. May we listen. May we obey. May we do what you have called us to do. We ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen.
Dr. Joel, thanks again. And as we look ahead to the next few weeks, I'm going to be doing a series called I Overcome. And so join me again, same time next week, as we look at the series and begin to unpack ways in which we can see God reign victoriously in our lives, so that our lives again may be testimonies to the world. Thanks for joining us. Dr. Joel, thank you very much.
Thank
Rachel
you.
at the controls, thank you. Awesome job as always. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye-bye now.